Good morning, church. It is great to be with you this morning, and I'm going to do something to start off this morning that my wife hates, because I'm going to talk about her. First of all, happy birthday. Tomorrow is my wife's birthday. I'm not going to tell you how old she is, although she's not the kind that cares, but happy birthday to you. I love you. She's like, cut it out, I'm going to cry. But I want to tell a little story about my wife and I. It's been almost 14 years since we got engaged. 13 years of marriage this year in May, so I guess over 14 years since we got engaged. We had a long engagement. It was over a year, I believe it was. And the reason it was over a year is because this guy couldn't wait. I was supposed to wait till a little later in the year, but the moment I got the ring, I had to order the ring, and I picked out what I wanted to use to propose to her, and I had to wait for it to arrive. And once it arrived, I was actually supposed to hold on to it for 2 to 3 months before I actually proposed. But once I had that ring in my hand, I'm the type of kid that my mom always said money burned a hole in my pocket. Whenever I got money, I instantly wanted to spend it. I was not a saver, definitely as a kid, and so even then, at that age, when I got the ring, I just couldn't wait. I was like, I'm not just going to sit on this for a while. I want to pop the question. I'm ready to get this moving and what have you. So I was living in Hattiesburg, Mississippi at the time, and Laura was coming down to visit me for the day. And I had this intricate plan that I was going to propose to her at this antique shop that we used to go to all the time. Not really antique shop, more like, well, yeah, it was an antique shop. And so my plan was I was going to hide the ring inside this old jewelry counter that they had in there where they sold jewelry. So we were going to be looking around, and then she's going to see this beautiful ring, and I'm going to go, hey, how do you feel about that one? And I was going to pull it out and get on a knee and propose. So I take her to this antique store, and we went there all the time. It was one of my favorite places to go. I found records and comic books and things like that I would buy. And I just love spelunking in places like that, and they were all over Hattiesburg at the time. And we'd gone there over and over again and multiple times together, and it was always just the two of us. That's one of the reasons I wanted it, is because it was going to be intimate. It was going to be like us and maybe the store clerk and a couple other people in the distance. But this was the one day that we went to this antique store, and there were people everywhere. Like, it was just like packed, and I was going, what are you guys doing here? It's a Thursday. Like, I don't even know why you're here. And it wasn't the right time. I couldn't do it then. It wasn't intimate enough. I wanted it to be just us. I didn't want a bunch of people crowding around and going, like, I didn't want that. I just wanted it to be us. And so I kept the ring in my pocket. I was wearing cargo shorts. I will never forget. You guys know cargo pants, the ones you sneak candy to the movie theater with? Right. So I had it in my pocket. I had it in my pocket, and I walked around with it all day. We went through the whole day, and I just kept waiting for this perfect moment where I could pull this ring out and ask her to marry me. I kept waiting for the moment to get there, and the moment never came. We went through the whole day. It got to that evening after we had had dinner. We actually went to Chuck E. Cheese for dinner, because wouldn't this be a hoot? And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna propose in front of the Chuck E. Cheese price counter. Like, I'm gonna let her pay tickets for this ring and be like, look what I got. And that didn't work either. I don't remember why, but it just wasn't right. So you know what we ended up going back to my apartment, and I ended up just proposing to her in my apartment. I just pulled out the ring and was like, look, I've been holding on to this all day, but I got to get this over with. Like, I can't wait any longer. And something that I wanted to be this grand, like, lightning bolt moment ended up just being me on my apartment carpet on a knee, telling this woman how much I love her and that I want to spend the rest of my life with her. What I'm getting at is this: I kept waiting for the right time, but the right time never came. There was no perfect moment. The perfect moment was the moment that I decided to do it. Everything happens in its time, and sometimes we're so busy waiting for just the right moment to do something that we miss out on the opportunity. If I had kept waiting for the perfect moment, I might have never actually asked her this very important question. So today what we're going to be looking at is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and we're going to be looking through the first 15 verses of this chapter. And what I want us to see here is, and you can see the title is Everything in Its Time. But what does that mean? Time is such a weird thing, because time is a human construct. Or really, it's something that exists in this world, but to imagine that God and eternity and heaven exist outside of time is bewildering to us. And we'll get to that more in just a few minutes. But I want us to go ahead and begin this morning by reading Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. It says, "There is an occasion for everything and a time for every activity under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to avoid embracing. A time to search and a time to count as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace." Will you pray with me this morning as we study God's Word? God, I love you and I thank you for this opportunity that we have to come here today to study your Word. God, to learn what you have to say to us through this book. God, through this that you have passed down to us over all these years. God, may we see it in a new light today, and may we see how we can look, serve, and act more like you. God, just bless these words. May they be yours and not mine. In your name I pray. Amen. So what we see first is this. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. One of my favorite things in the world, I love to laugh, and I love comedy. And if any of you are fans of comedy, you've probably learned or you probably know that comedy is all about timing. I was actually listening to a podcast this week, and John Cleese, the actor from Monty Python, was on this podcast, and he was talking about that he went to Cambridge. I did not know that. He's really smart, and he has a degree, and I believe he was in one of the sciences, but he ended up going into writing and comedy as a living, and he said the reason that he decided to do that is because he realized he had really good, if not perfect, comedic timing. That was what made him so good, at least in his own opinion and in those who worked with him, is that his timing was perfect. Because if you're going to be in comedy, if you're going to do sketch comedy and things like that, if you've ever seen a great comedian, you know that when they pause at just the right moment is what makes you laugh so hard. It's not just what they say, it's how they react to the things around them. And John Cleese was so good at those things. So we can see just from that example of comedy is that there is an appropriate time for everything. Just like comedy, when you know how to pause in the right place or say the right thing to get the best laugh, in life there are times that we need to hold back and there are times that we need to assert ourselves. There are times that we need to wait, and there are times that we need to hurry. And what we are trying to figure out in this life is when is the appropriate time to do what? And the truth is, I don't want you to get too excited. I don't have the answer for you. The answer is we have to rely on God. But timing is everything. So there's an appropriate time for everything. And we could look at this passage only as pertaining to that. I've already had somebody say, so you're preaching through Ecclesiastes, and you're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 next week, and it's talking about a time for everything that is so perfect for where we are in the country right now. And I could not agree with you more. But I also feel like if we only look at the surface, if we only look at that, we're missing a whole lot. So yes, it's applicable for that reason, because there's a time for war and there's a time for peace. There's a time to heal and there's a time to hurt. But we're going to look a little further than that, look a little deeper than that. So first thing we want to do is we want to see this representation in these first 8 verses of God's timing. The Old Testament commonly sees purposefulness in life coming from God's providential oversight of its occasions and seasons, according to Michael Eaton. The Old Testament sees things as God's timing being perfect and relying on God's timing in all occasions and all things happening under the providential umbrella of God. Well, this passage here, these first 8 verses that we just read, it consists of 7 lines and 14 merisms. All right, now that's a weird word. You probably never heard it before. I hadn't either. In the English translation, it appears as 2 lines per verse. But I want to show you the Hebrew. I know for any of you, remember like Hebrew was written backwards. Remember that? So the numbers are on the right side. But you see this is chapter 3. It looks like the numbers are cut off on this side. You can see them on this side. But you see it says lines 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and 9. In the Hebrew, those are 1 line. But in the English, if you're looking at your translation, they're probably cut into 2 lines per verse. But what we have here is 7 lines and 14 merisms. A merism is a literary device that uses opposites to represent completion. So birth, death, war, peace. See where we're going there? That's a merism. It's a literary illustration. Now, if you're not aware, the number 7 is a number representing perfection in the Hebrew culture. It's a number that represents completion. So the fact that there are 7 lines is not accidental. The author was very likely being very purposeful with this number of 7. So not only was it the number 7, but there are 14 merisms in 7 lines. So that's 7 doubled. That's actually doubly complete. That's the way they would see it. The number 666 is one that we consider a number of evil, a number that represents chaos, whereas 777 represents perfection. The number 7 in the Hebrew culture was very important. So the author is likely attempting to represent the whole of human experience through these 8 verses. He's trying to get your brain working because he's going to make his point after verse 9. But he wants to get your mind thinking about the human experience in verses 1 through 8. So let's look at what he says. First of all, in verse 1, he says, there is an occasion for everything and a time for every activity under heaven. And what does he mean by under heaven? Well, what he means is on this side of heaven, in this life, at this time. And then we have the first merism in verse 2. It's birth and death. Could there be a better one? Could there be one that more encompasses the human life? There's birth and there's death. We all experience it, and nobody has a choice as to when those things happen. You don't get to decide when you're born. And hopefully you don't get to decide when you die. So that's the first. The second one, there's verses 2 through 3. We have 3 other sets of merisms. And these are all relative to human activity. A time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, and a time to heal. You see that it's having to do with human activity. The next couple in verse 4 has to do with human emotion, things that we all experience. And then the next one in verse 5, the next couple is human relations, how we relate to one another. I love that in verse 5, there's a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. Now, that's what he's talking about is relationships. All right, there's times when we're arguing with one another, and there's times that that's appropriate. There's times when that needs to happen in order for healing to take place. But then there's also times when we need to gather stones. There's a video that I thought about showing you of 2 stick figures on either side of a crevice, and there's one stick figure that's throwing rocks at the other one on either side of this canyon. And as one's throwing rocks, the other one is gathering them, and he's using them to build a bridge to get to the other one. It's one of my favorite illustrations. But that's what he's talking about. There are times that it's necessary, but then there's also times we have to make sure we're not just on the defensive, we're also on the offensive. And then in verse 7, it's destructive and constructive activities of man. A time to tear down, a time to sow, a time to be silent, and a time to speak. With few exceptions, everyone will experience the things in this list in their lifetime. We all will experience these things at some point or another. The author is then relating our experience of life to one another, illustrating that, though vastly different, we also experience loss, gain, triumph, failure, etc. We all share in one thing, and that is this human experience. Although we all go different roads and we all go different ways, we have this in common, that we experience birth and death. We experience emotion. We experience relationships. We experience all of these things. Many of these merisms describe things of which we have no control. But most of these are out of our control. They describe things of which we do have control. Some of them describe things that we do have control of, like whether to laugh or to cry. But a lot of these things are things that are out of our control. A lot of them are how we react to our circumstances, which are also out of our control. This passage is more of a reminder that we are not in control of this life. It's more of a reminder that we're not in control than a guide on how we should go about doing things. These verses are trying to tell us, you don't have control. Well, who does? We'll get to that. Practice will never make perfect, says Edward Curtis, but it will make us better. I love that. Practice will never make perfect, but it will make us better. The more obedient we are and the more we rely on God, the better our timing becomes. There is a coherence to the Creator's timing that we, the creation, cannot understand. There is an order to this world that we were oblivious to, and we'll get to more of that in just a minute with our second point. But it reminds me of this. I bought a video game on my Xbox. That's this video game that my daughters love to play. And it's a video game that is it's a digital representation of Disneyland. So you are a character and you just get to run around Disneyland. You go and you collect coins, you can buy outfits, and you meet characters, and you can ride the rides like we did. We digitally rode It's a Small World the other day on my Xbox, and I'm thinking, one of these days they'll get there and they'll actually get to do that. But it's crazy because I've been playing video games since I was a little kid, and this whole thing about playing video games and moving around in a 3D space of moving the controller and using the controller is just second nature to me. But to my 5-year-old and my 7-year-old, they're just running into a wall and they can't figure out why they're not going anywhere. And they run into a trash can and they can't get around it. And I'm like, could you? Like they just can't manipulate. They haven't figured it out yet of how to get through this digital world using this controller. And for me, it just makes so much sense. And I think about that and I see that's what we're like from God's perspective. And there are times that Mabry will just look at me and hand me the controller and go, Daddy, you do it. And I just think, wow, wouldn't that be great if I could just go, God, you just do it. This is hard. I don't know how to get around the trash can. There is an order to this world that's just outside of us that we can't figure out. And so our frustration in this life comes from existing in a reality in which we cannot control it and we don't fully understand it. The bottom line is we don't. We don't understand it, and we just can't. That's where our frustration in this life comes from. If we look at ancient cultures, and even more modern ones, we'll see. If we look at just cultures throughout human history, there is an obsession with knowing the future. There is an obsession with gaining knowledge about what's going to happen. If we look, I have a thing I want to show you. This is actually a mold of an animal's liver, okay? And there is this method of divination or witchcraft or prophecy that's called hieromancy. And this tool was used for hieromancy. What they would do is they would sacrifice an animal and they would mix up the guts and the bones and they would do crazy things with it. But then they would take the liver and they would read the liver of that animal, and the gods, with little g, would speak to them through the liver. And this is one of the things that they would use to train diviners, I'm not sure how you're supposed to say that, potato, right? The people who read the livers, this is a thing that they would use to train them on how to read and sacrifice his liver so that you could know what the gods are saying. Wow. That's just one example. There's also something called ceromancy. In ancient and medieval European culture, wax was used to interpret the future. What they would do is they would melt wax in a brass bowl, and then they would pour that hot wax into water. And then the shapes that formed in that water, a diviner, whatever, they would read it, and they would have premonitions based on the shapes that formed out of the wax in the water. It's called ceromancy. This one might be my favorite. It's called pteromancy. And in rare ancient European medieval cultures, people would interpret messages by examining the patterns and holes that grew in cheese. Yeah, go ahead and laugh. That's weird. They would examine the holes in cheese. As a matter of fact, one of the folklore, one of the things that came out of this culture is that one of the traditions in one of these cultures was that young women would take pieces of cheese and they would write the names of prospective husbands on these pieces of cheese, and then they would lay them out, and the first one that grew mold was the one that they were supposed to be with. Isn't that interesting? I'll give you my source if you're like, that's a lie. I'll give you the source. I was just as shocked as you. Like, what? But do we not do similarly crazy things? There was a Civil War Confederate soldier who wrote an article for the Detroit Free Press in 1886 that claimed a soldier had a premonition of his own death when he was examining a bowl of water that had bubbles in it. And he claimed that he saw his own dead face in the bubbles. And the next day, he was killed by a cannonball. Do we not claim that sometimes we have premonitions? We live in New Orleans. This place is just steeped with voodoo and weird culture that we've grown up in. That's a big thing around here. Premonitions and knowing the future. But you know what? Children of the 80s, how about this? Do you know how this, anybody here not know what a magic 8 ball is? You have the ball and you shake it and you ask it questions and it gives you answers. When I was a kid, I was like, how does it do that? It's a 15-sided die suspended in water. Blue water for some reason, to make it mystic, right? But did we not actually use this? Can anybody in here that grew up in the 70s and 80s, or even around that time, did you not say that you actually was like, does she like me? Outlook not good. Like, right? As if it had some kind of bearing on life. But this is a hit toy. You realize that these have sold millions. I would love to have invented this or the pet rock, because I would be so wealthy. These things have sold millions of them. You can still buy them to this day. Because there's something about that we love this idea that we could somehow know the future or know what's going to happen. What about reading your horoscope? It's the same thing. My challenge is, if you read the horoscope, I want you to read only like if you're a Cancer, I want you to read one of the other ones for 6 months and just let me know what happens. Because they're all applicable to everybody is what I'm saying. So what are we getting at? We are desperate to know the future so that we can know the right thing to do when the time comes. But the point is this. You know what? I think we should change this. I think we should change this point. It shouldn't be timing is everything. It should be God's timing is everything. Because that's what it is. We think that our timing is everything. I have to make just the right decision at just the right time. And the truth is, no. We're supposed to be relying on God. There's a time to fight and a time to make peace. But we're supposed to wait on God to tell us what to do. We're supposed to wait on His perfect timing. The truth is that only God knows, which leads us to our next point. We are limited in our comprehension. We can't see the big picture. We can't see everything. It's like my daughter's trying to play that video game. I know more about this world and how to manipulate it than they do, but they're learning. And they're trying to figure out, and at times it's frustrating. At times, maybe we'll huff and puff and like, oh, I can't do it. I'm like, baby, just keep trying. Just keep trying. Don't give me that look. You'll get there. All right? You'll get there. And I understand that it's frustrating. Derek Kidner wrote this. I love the way he illustrates this. He says, we are like desperately nearsighted, inching their way, the desperately nearsighted, excuse me, I know that sounded weird. We are like the desperately nearsighted, inching their way along some great tapestry or fresco in an attempt to take it in. We see enough to recognize something of its quality, but the grand design escapes us, for we can never stand back far enough to view it as the Creator does, whole and entire from beginning to end. I love that illustration. It's like a tapestry that we can look at it and go, man, this is awesome. But there's part of it that we're completely missing because you can't see every other part. And that's the way it is. We're limited in our comprehension. What can we add to this life? Look at verses 9 through 11. It says, what does the worker gain from his struggles? I have seen the task that God has given the children of Adam to keep them occupied. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts, but no one can discover the work God has done from beginning to end. We are limited in our comprehension. What can we add to this life with our accomplishments? Nothing. Not if they're just ours. But if they're done for God, that's a whole other story. Our frustration in this life comes from a lack of ability to see the whole plan and know how we fit into it. Is that not what we say all the time? I just want to know God's plan for me. I just want to know what God wants me to do. If God would just tell me what He wants me to do. And the funny thing is that when we're asking that question, nine times out of 10, we're asking about the future. If you're in college, you're asking about who am I going to marry? If you're in high school, you're asking about where should I go to college? If you've graduated from college or you're out of high school or you're a young adult, you're thinking, what should I do for a living? And if you have a job, you're asking, when should I retire? It's always something that we're asking about in the future, but what God wants you to know is what He's calling you to right now. We're asking the wrong question. If you want to know what God's plan is for your life, then obey Him right here, right now, when you're going to look down the road 10 years later and go, oh, I see what you had for me. We always think about it in the future. I just want God to give me this vision. That's not how God works. I had a student, his name is Kaiser, and he's a youth pastor, I believe in South Carolina now. And when Kaiser was 16 years old, he looked me in the eye and he said, I'm going to be a youth pastor. I want your job. And I was like, man, that's awesome, because I wish I had that figured out when I was 16. I didn't give in to God's call until I was 21. It's like, you got a leg up on me, son. Sometimes God gives us this vision of, here's what I want you to do in life. And sometimes we're just so sure, but that is really rare. What God calls us to do is obey in the here and now. God has made everything in its time so that His purposes are accomplished. The Hebrew word used here that is illustrated most often in verse 11, it's illustrated beautiful. And that's a great word, obviously. Beautiful is a pleasant word, and we want to use that. But really, this translation should be a little bit different. And if you're looking in the CSB, and if you read along with me just now, in verse 11, my translation, the CSB says, He has made everything appropriate in its time. That's a more faithful translation of this Hebrew word that is yapha, that it's usually translated beautiful, but it can also mean fitting or appropriate. So I think that's a more fitting translation of that verse, a more appropriate translation of that verse. The Hebrew word means fitting or appropriate, that God has made everything appropriate in its time. In other words, He's got a plan. He's in control. He knows what He's doing, and it's up to us to trust Him, to know that He is in control. We have limited comprehension, so we just have to trust God. If there are times when my babies get frustrated with that video game, there are times that I step in and just go, look, stop moving that joystick and only use this one and go backwards. Get out from behind the trash can and go left, and let's move on. There are times that I have to intercede, but we have a limited view of what we see. The order of God's world includes patterns that suggest purpose and goals, according to Edward Curtis. And I think that I've seen that. There is purpose in this life. There is a pattern that He has set in play that we don't understand. I don't know how the pandemic is going to factor in to the whole of God's creation, to the whole of God's plan. I don't know how the craziness that has been going on in this world, in our government, particularly for the past week, is going to fit in to the history of the world or the history of this country. But what I do know is that there is a plan that I don't comprehend, that I'm just going to trust in. That I know God's got me. I know God's got America. I know God's got my family. And I'm going to trust Him no matter what. Because my comprehension is limited. So why would I try to grasp it? The means by which we contribute to the big picture is to fulfill our place in God's plan through obedience to Him. Otherwise, we're like a lost puzzle piece to a jigsaw puzzle. We serve no purpose. Because we can't be found. We're not serving our place. Edward Curtis wrote this. He said, the teacher claims that while humans do have some control over their lives, they have less than many suppose, and far less than most people desire. God's providence is at work in ways that can neither be predicted nor resisted, and His providence sometimes impacts outcomes that ordinarily seem to fall within our control. When this occurs, it is God's purpose that will prevail. The teacher makes it clear that human independence and autonomy are not the final determiners of our outcomes, certainly not ultimate ones. This serves as a reminder that the goal of biblical wisdom is not to provide full knowledge that allows us to control our circumstances and outcomes, but rather to enable us to live in harmony with the purposes of God in the order that He has designed into the universe. Our comprehension is limited. And lastly, let's look at this. The second half of verse 11 through 15. He has also put eternity in their hearts, but no one can discover the work God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. I know that everything God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. God works so that people will be in awe of him. Whatever is has already been, and whatever will be already is. However, God seeks justice for the persecuted. I mentioned at the beginning proposing to my wife. And it's one of those moments that anybody in here who's married, you go back to that moment over and over again. And I think about moments I've had with my family, that I've had with my bride. Have you ever had moments where you just think to yourself, or you say to another person, I just wish this moment could last forever? We all do, right? Whether it's that you went to Disney World or that it was your wedding day. Whatever it is, you've had a moment at some point in your life, I'm sure, where you said, I just wish I could have this feeling forever. And I think about heaven. And I think about taking that moment that I've said, I wish this could last forever. And taking that moment and stretching it out for eternity and multiplying it times 1 billion. As far as my happiness and my joy is concerned. Heaven's not going to be like that. It's going to be even better. But isn't it interesting that we say this phrase of, I wish this moment could last forever? That there are moments in our lives that we can pinpoint and just say, I wish I could just stay there. Laura and I say all the time, like, why do our girls just why do they have to keep growing up? Like, I just want to keep them babies. I know most of you, if you're parents, you've probably been there. The reason is because we have an intrinsic desire for the everlasting. There is something about us that longs for something that doesn't end. You name me one thing in your life that never ends. Not even your life does that. Songs are 3 to 5 minutes long unless you're a Grateful Dead fan. Movies have credits. The credits roll. Relationships come and go. Pets die. Family members and friends die. We die. There is nothing in this life that we know that doesn't have an end point. Our frustration in this life comes from existing in a reality in which we desire the eternal, but we live in the temporal. We desire something that lasts forever. And I'm going to be honest with you, church. Eternity scares the mess out of me. Because I think about this idea of the sun not setting. Or my watch just stopping and it not mattering. I have this weird fear of the fact that eternity baffles me. Because I don't know what eternal feels like. None of us do. But the truth is that there is some part of us that longs for that. The Hebrew word that's used here, that's holam, refers to eternity in a sense of not just the future, in a sense of future, present, and past. It includes all time. We always have this image of, when I die, my grandma's going to be up there waiting for me. And I had this weird inclination. I was like, wait a minute. Heaven exists outside of time. My grandmother is not sitting in heaven waiting on me. It's going to be like we all got there at the same time. There's not people sitting up there going, I wonder when Brian's going to get here. No, there's no time there. They're unaware of what's happening here in this life. It exists outside of time. God exists outside of time. He can see me. He can see my grandma. He can see Adam and Eve, and He can see the end. He sees all of it. And there is a part of us that longs for that. Present, past, and future. Heaven is not just the future. Heaven just is. C.S. Lewis said, this is one of my favorite quotes from him. He said, if I find within myself a desire that this world cannot satisfy, then the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. That's what is in us. Ecclesiastes, the teacher, says He has put eternity in our hearts. Whether we recognize it or not, there is something within us that just longs for something eternal. And the only thing that is eternal is God. And therefore, because we have a piece of Him, because we are the imago Dei, because we are made in the image of God, then therefore we are also eternal. This example, exists in Christian music that's been over the past couple of 2 decades or so, I feel keeps coming up. You probably have heard a song by Building 429 that says, "All I know is I'm not home yet. This is not where I belong." One of my favorite songs when I was in high school was a song called "Alien" by Third Day, and part of the lyrics was was just like the alien, I'm a stranger in a strange land because this is not my home. I'm just visiting here. My home is with God. But my favorite example is one of my favorite bands is a band called Switchfoot, and they have a song called "The Beautiful Letdown." And it was in the song, part of the lyrics goes like this: "It was a beautiful letdown the day I knew that all the riches this world had to offer me would never do. I don't belong here, and I will carry a cross in a song where I don't belong." We are visitors in this world. This is not our home. We feel the need for ourselves and for our work to be eternal, and yet are grieved to be trapped in this trap of time. We also desire to understand our place in the universe against the backdrop of eternity, but this yearning, this unease, is designed to draw us to God. The fact that there's something in this life that we can't satisfy, that there's this eternal longing in us, is God telling us, "Come to me." That's God drawing us to Himself. That there's something we can't fill, there's something we can't satisfy. We have an intrinsic desire for the eternal, and therefore, we have an intrinsic desire for God, for the everlasting. This life is a gift from God. Look at this in verse 13. It says, "It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts." I'm a little late on time, but I'm going to do this. I'm going to go over to the piano for a second. So when I was in high school, there was a band that was very popular called Audio Adrenaline. And I'm not going to sing Big House, don't get excited. But they had a song that was called "The Good Life." And it was a song talking about the good life that we expect in this world. What people describe as the good life is a life of riches and fame and popularity and accomplishments. But when I was in high school, I believe I was a senior in high school when this album came out, and this song just really impacted me. "This is the good life. I lost everything I could ever want, ever dream of. This is the good life. I found everything I could ever need here in your arms. This is the good life. I lost everything I could ever want, ever dream of. This is the good life. I found everything I could ever want here in your arms." And I remember being 17 and hearing that song and thinking about my dad and thinking about the things that my parents went without because my dad lived a life of ministry. And realizing that the good life that the Bible is talking about is not the good life that the world talks about. That when the teacher says in Ecclesiastes to live the good life, it means to live the life of obedience, to live the life of subservience, to follow God with what we do. And even if we end up with nothing in the end, we've gained everything because we've obeyed Him. That is the good life. God's work, as we see in verse 14, will last forever. Whatever is done in His name will last forever. Anything done in our name will fade away. God is God, and humans are human. We see that in verse 14 as well. God works so that people will be in awe of Him. The fear of the Lord, in some of your translations, it may say so that you may fear God. In other words, it may say what mine says, that you will be in awe of God. In Ecclesiastes, it goes beyond the typical illustration of just in awe of God. What he's talking about is reminding us that God is great. God is omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful. He's God, and you're not. I'm not. We're not. It is a reminder that God is in control. But then we also see in verse 15, he repeats the point that he made in the beginning in chapter 1, verse 9, that there is nothing new under the sun. The teacher reiterates his previous point, that nothing is truly new. God created everything that was, is, and will be, and His purpose to rescue the fallen will be the ultimate outcome, no matter what we do. God's purpose cannot be thwarted. God's purpose cannot be stopped. What He has planned will happen no matter what. So as Brian comes up to give an invitation this morning, I want to challenge you with this. We have an intrinsic desire for the eternal. We have a desire to have purpose, to have meaning, to have a place where we belong in this life, and to know where that is and what that is. But to know and to follow God is to be assured of the eternal and to know our eternal destiny. Our means to know God and to follow Him in this life at this time is Jesus Christ. Not only is it Jesus Christ, but our example is Jesus Christ on how we can live the good life, on how we can follow Him. This morning, if you need to commit to a relationship with Jesus Christ, I want to challenge you to do that. I will be down here. I can pray with you. I can speak with you. If you feel that you need to respond, if you're watching live from home, or if you just came across this recording, whether it be in the future or right here, right now, there's a link in the description of this video that says to respond. If you will click on that link and fill out the form, I will personally respond to you. Or church, if you just need to pray this morning, whether that be in your seat or at this altar, I want to give you this opportunity to do that. Will you pray with me? God, we love you, and we thank you that everything is in your time. God, that you are in control, and despite the chaos that is going around us, that we've been in a pandemic for over 9 months, God, that we've had moments where we're scared. We've had many moments where we're questioning and wondering what's going to happen. God, that we've lost friends, we've lost loved ones, whether that be to sickness or to estrangement or what have you. God, our country is in a place where it needs healing. God, because I believe fervently it's because they need you, because we need you. God, because we're never going to be able to get along if we can't agree on what we all need. And that's healing. It's salvation. But God, I pray this morning, if there's a person here that is watching at home or watching this in the future or is in this room right now that does not have a relationship with you, God, I pray that you would move in that person's heart. God, that you would draw them into you and help them to make that decision to make you their Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Draw us into yourself. In your name I pray. Amen.
There's hope for the hopeless, and And all those who stray, come sit at the table, and come taste His grace. Rest for the weary, a rest that endures. For earth has no sorrow heaven can't heal. No, earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. So lay down your burden, lay down your shame. For all who are broken, lift up your face. And oh, wanderer, come home, 'cause you're not too far. So lay down your hurt and lay down your heart, and come as you are.